Good morning, everybody. It's an overcast, drizzly day here in usually sunny Central Florida. And so instead of mowing my grass, I'm sharpening a knife. And it's more fun anyway, although I don't mind mowing grass. But that's beside the point. Today we have a very beautiful knife. I don't have an exact date for this, but it's probably from the mid 1900s. This is a Clyde Cutlery blade, a 14-inch chef's knife. It is absolutely enormous, and we're going to sharpen this today. But first, let's talk about it a little bit. So this has a fairly slender type blade profile. It's very long. It's not a very deep blade for its length. But this is an American-made chef's knife. You can tell by the shape it's very much inspired by French-style chef knives of the period, and but it has some interesting differences. If we compare it to a comparable antique French knife, and this one had a broken tip, so I had to recontour the tip a little, but the original would have been very similar in shape to the Clyde Cutlery knife. This is an old Dufresne, excuse me, an old Dufresne Company knife. And even though the Dufresne Company knife was overall a larger blade, I think you can see that it's deeper and wider than the Clyde. If you look very closely, you can tell that the Dufresne Company knife is thicker, closer to the handle, but tapers very gradually out to the tip, and this makes for a very light knife. This knife was certainly intended to be a fine culinary implement. It's very nicely balanced for all kinds of chopping. It's very nimble despite its immense size. It's light as a feather and balances nicely in the hand. This Clyde Cutlery knife, you can tell, remains fairly thick throughout its length until very close to the tip, and it makes for a heavier feeling knife, which is weighted more toward the tip than the other. So I'm going to guess that this was intended to be a little bit more of a butcher's knife, kind of a sturdier, cruder implement than the other one. But regardless, it's a very nice knife. It came to me with some large rust spots on it and whatnot, and I have polished it up and essentially refurbished the blade. One interesting and fortuitous fact about this knife is that right around the logo there was virtually no corrosion, which means that I was able to preserve the stamp, and that's a beautiful thing. So let's get to the sharpening. Whenever you're dealing with an old, well-loved, well-used knife, one of the most important things to do initially is to figure out if the cutting edge has any high or low spots that interfere with its ability to seat properly on the cutting board. Because when you're cutting things, you want to cut all the way through them. And a good way to do that, I'm going to do it right now, is to hold it up to a window or other light source and look between the cutting edge and the cutting board and see if there are gaps where you can see light coming through. And you can't really see it here, but this knife has a high spot right around in here, which kind of the heels is good, and the main area of the knife and the belly of the knife are good. There's a little bit of a high spot right here, which keeps it from seating perfectly on the cutting board. So let's get rid of that. So the first step here is to get the cutting profile of the knife fully restored to its to where it will be very functional once it's sharp. So I have here I'm going to angle the camera down now because my face is far less important than the sharpening. So this is my Atoma 400 grit diamond plate, and I love diamond plates for repair work and restorative type things. I mean, a traditional whetstone is great, will yield, in almost all instances, will yield a better, smoother, sharper result than a diamond plate will. However, the benefit of a diamond plate is that they stay absolutely flat. They last forever. And so I like to use them when I need to work on the cutting profile of a knife. So we're going to do just a little bit of flattening in the heel section of this knife. The other benefit of a diamond plate is that the diamond material is far harder than the steel, even carbon steel. And that means that you can't cut it. You can literally saw blade edge down right into a diamond plate. And it will not harm it at all. You cannot do this with a whetstone. What I'm doing right now, the knife would simply cut into it, and then I'd have a big gouge in my whetstone. So for flattening an edge, for truing an edge up, there's no better thing than a diamond plate. I also have a 140 grit diamond plate, which I like to use for very major repairs. For instance, if there was a big chip in this edge and I needed to remove a lot of metal, the 140 is great for that sort of thing. All right. So a quick sighting down the edge shows that it is now virtually straight and flat. So let's just do a few more passes here just to be sure. And then we're going to start creating a new bevel on this thing. So what I have now is the heel of the knife is like a butter knife, but out toward the tip, it's not. And that means I'm in my initial sharpening stages, I'm going to have to spend more time down in the heel where I just flatten the edge. But that's it has a very good shape now. That knife was nearly immaculate. It didn't take very much. I have a number of various whetstones soaking in my sink and otherwise standing by here, because when you're working on an old knife, you never know what you're going to need. This is my 220 grit whetstone, and it's coarse. It removes material very fast, but still leaves a fairly smooth and consistent scratch pattern. And from here, we'll move on to finer stones to get to the actual sharpening. So, as far as the actual sharpening motions, we're going to work the entire length of the blade against the stone. However, what I've just done is flattened the edge from here up to about here. And that means we're going to spend a fairly considerable amount of time reestablishing this bevel in this area before we get out to the tip areas of the knife. So this blade is mostly pretty straight, so we're going to use a basic push and pull method. When I get out here toward the tip where it's curved, you'll see me making a more curved kind of stroke just in the last 3 to 4 inches of the blade, but about a good 10 inches of the blade are absolutely straight, and so this lends itself well to a very straightforward thing. So I like to work the left side of the knife first with the edge facing away from me, because I find this side a little more awkward for some reason. And I feel like if I get this side out of the way first, then the other side's easy. So let's start rebeveling this. Western chef knives are typically sharpened at a 15 to 17 degree angle per side. I have an intuition that this knife can take a little bit finer edge than that. So I'm not going too crazy, but I am not being shy about attempting to sharpen this knife at an angle that might be slightly more acute than a typical Western knife. I like to stop often and check progress and just see how I'm doing and make sure that the work I'm doing is producing a fairly even result. And this is, in this case, normally with a knife that already has an established edge, I would typically sharpen one side of the knife until I feel a burr all the way down. In this case, because I have just done a considerable amount of flattening in the heel section of the knife, I'm going to work the heel back and forth on the stone a few times and make sure there's a good V there before I start worrying about feeling a burr. Because at this point, if I waited to feel a burr, it would mean that I had produced a one-sided V, and that is not good. Alright, so let's work the other side of the knife a little bit. I find this side very easy to do. Alright, so there is beveling on both sides now throughout the heel section. And I don't have any sign of a burr yet, but that's not very surprising considering how I flattened things out and left myself with a square edge. Okay. You may notice a slurry building up on this stone, and slurry is good. Slurry sharpens. Whenever you're sharpening on a whetstone, you do not want to remove this slurry. If it gets too pasty and sticky, simply add a little water and move it around on there. Alright, so we've got a really nice beginnings of the bevel going on the one side. On both sides, that is. Normally, for a standard sharpening procedure, I would be making passes down the entire length of the blade, and we'll get to that. But because I have flattened this heel section out so much, I want to get it fairly close to where the rest of the blade is going to be, and then we will begin working the entire blade. Alright, beginning to feel the bare beginnings of a burr developing on this side. And I find it's funny, for me, the right side of the knife, when I'm doing it this way with the edge close to me, this works, and this side tends to go faster. So I have to be very careful about over sharpening, over beveling this side of the knife versus this one, versus the left side of the knife. So I tend to do more work on this side to make sure that I'm not over beveling one side versus the other with this kind of coarse repair work. You don't want the apex of your edge to be off center. I mean, if it's a, 100th of an inch off center or something, it doesn't matter. When you're doing this kind of freehand stuff, nothing's ever going to be perfect, but we like to get it pretty close and keep things as even as we can. Alright, we're getting a nice V going. It's still pretty dull. There's still more work to do. So I'm going to do a few more passes on each side of the knife for about the first 8 inches of the blade or so. The slurry gets up onto the sides of the blade, and I tend to scrape it off and put it back on the stone. I have my sink full of water here next to me, which you can't see in the picture, but I periodically will wash the knife off a little so that I can see what I'm doing. And alright, we're doing some pretty good work here. We still haven't reached the center of the edge. I can feel it down here where I did not flatten. There is a good edge which will sharpen up very quickly, but starting about right here, from here to the heel, it's still dull. So that means I have more beveling work to do. Alright, let's do a little more on this side. You'll notice as I work the length of the knife down the stone, I keep moving my fingers. And these are the fingers that apply pressure. And it's not a lot of pressure, but it's very important to move your fingers down the stone as you want to keep your fingers kind of centered on the stone as you move the knife. Wherever your fingers are pushing, that's basically where you're sharpening. So if you don't move your fingers, you are not sharpening the entire edge. And that's very bad. All right. I'm getting a little overdeveloped on this side, and that means I need to spend more time on my weak side. As I wipe the slurry off the blade to check progress, I like to put it back on the whetstone. At some point, this almost gets to be like playing with Play-Doh or something. The slurry is mostly material from the stone mixed with particles of metal from the blade of the knife. And the slurry is what really does the work. And so you do not want to remove the slurry from the stone, because then you'll simply be wearing more and more into the stone itself. Leave the slurry there, moisten it if necessary, smooth it out if necessary, but let it do its job. One thing you find getting into these longer knives is, and these things were made by hand, these old ones, and sometimes there may be a thicker area of the blade, as you're going along here, this part might be real thin, and then it might thicken out a little and get thin again, and you'll find that your bevel, and it's especially apparent on these coarse stones where it really takes the polish off the edge, that your bevel, even though you're keeping the same angle, that your bevel can be a little wider. So as you're going down the side of the knife, your bevel can be pretty narrow and then get wider. Of course, I'm exaggerating for effect, but I have a spot right here where the bevel is looking fairly wide, and I'm trying to avoid letting it get ridiculous, but to make the kind of edge that I'm trying to make here requires getting enough metal out of the way so that the finer stones can really get on the edge. And all this, coarse, I don't know if we can see this, but you can tell that because I polished this blade all the way down to the edge, and I think you can tell by this work I'm doing here that the glaze of the polish is being taken away and leaving a kind of a matte finish, and that's fine. And inevitably you may be able to see here a little bit of scratching from the stone going up above the bevel, and that happens. So you get a little a little clump of slurry or something that'll do that, and that's all right. I can polish it out later with some fine sandpaper if I need to once the sharpening is complete. Not a big deal. If you're getting scratches all the way up your blade, that means you're trying to sharpen at way too shallow of an angle, and you're scuffing the entire blade, and we don't really want to do that. Knives that are made to take extremely fine angles are thinned so that that sort of thing will not be a problem. All right, we're approaching bringing the apex of this blade together. So I'm going to do another pass or two on each side for here about the first 8 inches of the blade. Slurry back on the stone. Going to add a little bit of water. It's not really sticking, but I'd rather keep the slurry in place on the stone where it can do work than have it, once it becomes too putty-like, it tends to really ride up the edge of the blade, and that's not doing any good. So we're definitely removing a lot of metal here. Feel just the bare beginnings of a burr forming on that side of the knife. And that bevel, this must be a particularly thick part of the blade right in here, because that apparent bevel is like coming way out right in that area of the knife. And that's alright. We'll polish it out later if it's an issue. Alright, I'm starting to feel a tiny bit of crispiness there. So I think I'm going to do one more pass on this side of the knife in the heel area. And then we're going to start working the entire blade on the quartz stone, just to make sure we have a good crispy bevel all the way down before we start moving on to the finer stones. The vast majority, when you're doing a repair type sharpening of an old knife like this, the vast majority of your time is going to be spent on these coarsest stones. I may, after we got off the 220 grit here, I may pop it briefly onto my 400 grit just to do a little bit of cleaning and smoothing and crisping before we move on to the 1000 grit. Alright, so I'm starting to feel nice. Need a little more work right at the tip of the heel. But I'm starting to feel some crispness developing in the apex. So we got a little spot right here, and then right at the heel, a little bit of work to do. So let's work this spot just a little bit. Bring it together. I don't know if you can hear that. When you start to hear that sound, when you drag your wet thumb across the edge, that means you are approaching a good edge. A very dull edge will sound like this. Just rubbing my thumb on the top of the knife. Let's do it out here toward the tip. It rings the blade but does not give the scrapey kind of sound. By the way, if you, let's say you're looking at a knife, I don't know, you're in a thrift store and you see an old knife in the bin and it's $1, and you wonder to yourself, is this knife made of good steel? Could this be a forged carbon steel knife? You're not sure. Maybe it's got some rust on it. So you think, well, it might be carbon steel because it's rusty. Or, you know, you never know. Here's a great test. Good steel, if you flick it, it will ring. Listen to this. This is good steel. You hear that? That beautiful pure tone? if you flick a knife and it goes thud, it's garbage. I mean, it may be good for sharpening practice. It may be good to use as a beater knife. I mean, I have a few cheap knives in my collection that if you flick it, they will thud, but I did manage to get them sharp, and they're actually useful. So I'm not saying never buy a knife that thuds when you flick it, but if you want to know if a knife is really made of good steel, there's your test. You can do that anywhere. You don't need to take samples and send them off to a laboratory. And by the way, there are some inexpensive knives out there that will ring when you flick them. Alright, so we need a little bit more work right at the heel here. I'm going to spend about a minute doing that, and then we're going to start sharpening the entire edge. And I'm going to shut up a little bit. Sitting here making these passes and wondering how many people at home right now are watching this video and are pulling their knives out of the drawers and flicking them. And it kind of tickles me to think that I just may have set off a worldwide epidemic of knife blade flicking. Alright. A little bit more on this side, right in the heel, and to target this, you know, your whetstones, of course whetstones can be flattened, but they don't, unless you're sharpening single bevel Japanese knives, Debas, Yanagabas, single bevel Gyotos, etc. You don't need to flatten your whetstones constantly. Because what happens is that the stones basically take a shape that's complementary to your personal sharpening motions. And so the stone will be, the parts of the stone that you use will sort of remain in a pattern. But in my case, I go this way, and that means that this corner and this corner will tend to ride a little higher over time. I will kind of wear out this sort of diagonal across here. But that can be useful because when you want to work on a particular little section of a knife, you can ride it up into those corners. So in this case, I'm literally trying to work just about that much of this heel. And so some care is needed here not to run the knife